Hey, welcome to Madness Works. Today we're going to be going over a project that was requested, and I'm just going to go over some quick cutting. You're going to see videos of cutting, and we will go right into using the epoxy. So I can show you guys how to properly prepare your project and pour the epoxy and what care you need to do during the curing process. Stay tuned. We're going to be flattening the cherry on my CNC machine, and then we'll flatten the other side with the planer. All right, we got our board all flattened. We're going to take some measurements and load the file. Once your project is done drying from the clear coat that you put on your project, you're going to want to make sure that you hit any areas where your epoxy is going to touch with some rubbing alcohol or mineral spirits. I have mineral spirits in here. I like to keep them in here because it's an easy pour spout. What you're doing is you're removing any residual particles of dust or anything that's on there and oils from your hands that you may have left on the project. Once you get done clearing it off, it's ready for the first coat of epoxy. So you're gonna see me pouring the first coat of epoxy and we're just gonna zap right through that. So let's get ready for that. So I use these cups because they have ridges on them. They're little bathroom cups. I call them bathroom cups. I guess you can call them juice cups or mouthwash cups. And I just line them up to the ridges to help me make sure I have an equal amount in each cup. All right, besides wearing gloves so you don't get epoxy on your hands when you're mixing it, you're also gonna wanna wear gloves because there are times where you wanna massage the epoxy into your wood. And what I mean is when you pour your epoxy, you're gonna get these areas where it looks like there was oil that repelled the water away, kind of like how oil and vinegar don't mix with each other. So what I like to do is I just take my hand and I'll take my finger and just massage it into the wood like this. And if you do that, you'll feel these spots that feel like they have tension down there. And what you're doing is you're ensuring that those flat spots or those voids don't happen to you during the curing process. Another way to do that is with toothpicks. It doesn't work as well, but if you have small areas like I have on this one, that's the best you can get. Convince the epoxy that it's going to move into that area. What I do is I use this container right here because it comes with a cover and it helps keep dust out during the curing process. And before we set it away to cure, we're gonna go ahead and hit it with a heat gun to remove any bubbles. Now you shouldn't have to worry about bubbles too much because we already did a clear coat on the wood, so no bubbles should be rising from underneath the epoxy. Once it looks like you've taken care of all the bubbles, cover your project. Give it about 10 or 15 minutes. I say probably every 10 minutes come out for like half an hour and just hit it with this heat gun just to ensure that no surprise bubbles happen. And once you're done hitting it with the heat gun, cover it, set a timer for 10 minutes, come back and hit it with the heat gun again. So our project's done curing. We're gonna go ahead and pull the project out and take a look at it. Trying to get some light on this guy. There we go. So it looks really good. I just have a couple small surface pinholes where the epoxy was thickening up and the bubbles were coming up and the bubbles would pop, but they didn't get to level out, so they got stuck as like a little divot. And what I'm gonna do is we're gonna sand it, put another real thin layer of epoxy on it. When we put the layer on it, the layer will go ahead and sit right on the surface and you won't even see those pinholes. They'll fill right in perfectly. And because it's epoxy, there's no bubbles that are gonna have the ability to come up through the pores of the wood. So we're lucky there. So let's go ahead and do that. All we're doing is we're just gonna scuff up the surface right here in the middle and create some grooves for the epoxy to hold on to, because since it's such a slick surface, it's gonna have trouble holding on to just a slick surface. I'm just using 240 grit sandpaper and I'm just gonna do a light sanding and then clean it off. We just got done doing a little bit of a light sanding, just enough to make sure that the epoxy adheres when we pour on the new layer. Spread it off with the air hose, and we're gonna hit it again with some mineral spirits. While we're letting it dry from the mineral spirits, we're gonna go ahead, put some gloves on, mix up some epoxy. Done mixing the epoxy, now it's time to pour some. Every now and then, all of us run into issues with our projects. And for this project, I ran into a lot of issues with epoxy. Instead of pouring just one coat of epoxy on it, I had a little bit of a surface imperfection, so I wanted to pour a second layer. But when I poured that second layer, it did not go well. I had to take some evasive course actions, and I had to start pulling out pieces of epoxy as it was curing, because it was just curing way too fast in certain areas. And it would start to look really cloudy. It would look like bubbles. It wasn't bubbles, it was just really cloudy. And so I just started pulling those pieces out, and I'll throw up a little picture so you guys can see that. So after I did that, I had these serious divots in my project, in my epoxy. It was just ugly. And I just couldn't let that fly, of course. None of us would be able to do that. And I was freaking out. I thought I was gonna have to completely start this project over from scratch. I just treated it like it was a normal pour, and after it cured, I started sanding it, and this is what we came up with, right? Now what you can see is you're gonna see a little bleed over from the epoxy in some areas, like right over here. And you're gonna see some damage control I was trying to do where there's drops and lines of epoxy from when I was pulling that epoxy out, you know, trying to do that damage control. So what we're gonna have to do now is we're gonna have to get rid of those pour overs. I understand that not everybody's gonna have this ability. Easiest way to do it is go ahead and sand it all out, make sure it's level. But I have a CNC machine, so I'm gonna put it on my CNC machine. I got the double-sided tape on. I'm gonna peel off the tape, lay it down, and just do a real fine resurfacing of the project. And what that'll do is it'll still give me a nice level surface, and I'll go ahead and be able to give it a real light sanding, and then I'm just gonna do my very final flood coat. It'll be a very, very, very thin flood coat, and making sure I'm touching on the edges. My original plan was to have the wood just be natural color, but this issue led me to have flood coat over the entire thing. It's still gonna look really gorgeous. It's just gonna have to do a flood coat, and I'm used to doing those anyway, so let's see how it goes. Well, here we are. We're at the end of the project. With this project, we're gonna end the video a little bit differently than I normally would. I ran into some issues with the epoxy. I'm gonna go over a couple pictures when I'm talking, pop up a couple pictures to show you guys an example of what I'm talking about. And the reason we're ending the video like this is because I got into a little bit of a oh crap mode, and I had to get the project out as quickly as possible. I gave the project a generous 2-week timeline to get it done. Due to this being my part-time hobby, I work on my projects in between my work schedule. So when I'm working during the day, I'll come home, do a couple hours in the garage, working on a project. Of course, with epoxy, you gotta let it cure. With this project, I believe it was 5 layers of epoxy that I was using to try to correct the issues that I was running into. So the issues I was running into is this first picture right here was a really good outcome. This was my first pour. And this is originally what I planned on my project being. I wanted to have a lot of wood showing in the project and the epoxy level being below the surface of the wood. The reason I had to pour a second coat, which I really didn't want to do, is the epoxy the temperature was a little bit cold, and when the epoxy hardened, as the bubbles were popping on the top, usually you'll see a bubble pop and the epoxy will level out. With this one, after it popped, it didn't level out. It kept a little divot in there. So I was like, all right, no big deal. Sand it up and clean it, mix our second batch of epoxy, and poured the second layer of epoxy. Now, when I poured my second layer of epoxy, it started to cure unevenly. I guess what is referred to as a flash cure. I had small areas right in the middle of the project where the epoxy was hardening really quickly, and it looked like it was bubbles, but you could tell it wasn't bubbles. It had like a visual representation of microscopic bubbles all bunched up into one area. So I ran and grabbed a toothpick, just poked at it a little bit because it was only about 20 minutes into pouring the epoxy and trying to pop the bubbles. And those areas was like a glob inside the epoxy. And I was like, what in the world is going on? So I started, as I said before, taking evasive action, popping out the epoxy. And this was the result, which was just a big glob from a couple areas within the epoxy. And the epoxy was starting to cure, and when I pulled these globs out, those areas didn't level out. So I was left with pretty deep and large area divots inside the main portion, the large portion of the blue of the project, and then around the star in the middle. And so that left me to have to pour a third layer. In this picture, you see that the third layer over toward the left was poured, and this is the final cure of that layer. And what you can see in this picture is that the epoxy level got so high from the expansion that it ran over a few of the edges and of the wood. And the wood itself wasn't perfect because as I was pulling that quick drying epoxy out, those pieces, I was just trying to rip it right off the project. And of course it was still dripping with epoxy, and so the epoxy dripped onto the exposed wood pieces, and I would have had to sand them anyway. So I had to sand this project. So I took this project, the bottom was flat, so I threw it on the CNC and I CNC'd it down. I had the entire surface flat. So what I did from there was I poured a flood coat. I decided I was gonna pour a flood coat, and I poured a flood coat. When I poured that flood coat, I was still having issues with it curing. It looked like that there were dust particles on the top of the epoxy. So I was like, all right, well, I'm gonna have to pour another layer, so let's try something new. And I didn't want to pour another layer. I wanted that epoxy finish, but I knew it was gonna be tough to get. So I started sanding it, and I went all the way up to 1000 grit. And then I was gonna try to polish it out. I didn't really have the appropriate polish for epoxy, but I tried what I had on hand, which was car polish, and I had a couple other things that I tried using, and it wasn't giving me the right look that I was looking for. So I cleaned it all off, resanded, and poured another flood coat. And I think at this point it was my 5th flood coat. And in between all these flood coats, in between flood coat 2 and 3, I decided to change the brand of epoxy, because originally I was using Total Boat epoxy. And Total Boat was giving me this weird foamy bubble effect on the edges near the wood where the stripes are. And so I sanded that out, no big deal, but I was like, if this epoxy is gonna keep causing issues for me, I'm just gonna change to a Amazon special brand epoxy that I have. I don't even remember the name of it. Worked with that epoxy, and I was still getting the same results. So that's when I realized there's still a continuing problem here. In the middle of all this, the other thing I did was, instead of using mineral spirits, I went out and purchased some 99.9% isopropyl alcohol in a spray bottle and gave that a shot. And that's what my problem was with the fourth cure, was I sprayed a fine mist isopropyl alcohol onto the layer of the epoxy. And the end result was not good. Saw videos where people were doing this and they liked what they were getting. It didn't work for me. It actually caused a lot of bubbles on the surface, where it gave me that look of how I talked to you guys about massaging the epoxy into the wood, and how water and oil don't mix, they repel each other, and that's the effect that I was getting. And I was like, clearly there's a problem here. So I stopped it with that nonsense, resanded, poured my 5th layer, and the 5th one still didn't come out perfect. So like I said, I sanded that down, and this time when I sanded it down to 1,000 again. After my 5th layer and sanding to 1,000, I decided to try using the Total Boat wood honey, the wood finish that comes in what looks like the bottle of honey that's shaped like a bear. And I feel like it came out really nice. I was like, this product that I have right here, it's the first time I tried this. This is a product that I was making for a really good friend, and I was not gonna, not that I would with anybody else, but I wasn't gonna let this leave imperfect. He sent me a message and he was like, hey, it's okay if it's not perfect. But I told him, I was like, no, you're just too great of a friend to let something like this, for me to ship something like this to you. I refuse to ship something not complete, not as perfect as can be to him. And when I saw this finished product, I was like, dang, this is done. And it has this really nice matte looking finish to it, but it's not super flat. It has depth. It gave it really nice character. I like how like the lines around the wooden stripes, it's just a little bit darker. It just makes it stand out. It's crisp, and I just loved it. This was the final product that I sent to him, and I was very happy with this. I wouldn't have sent it to anyone if it wasn't finished. And if you look at my last video, you'll see where I tore the tape off the back. It peeled off really easy. I gave it a quick sanding on the back side to get rid of those sharp edges left over from the epoxy. I had 0 issues. Like my last product where I was peeling it off and the tape was ripping. This one, the tape ripped a little bit, but I just grabbed onto it, pulled it off again. Once it was all off, I had a little bit of epoxy, very, very little, that soaked underneath the tape, and I just sanded it down and came out nice. And then I threw my logo on the back of it with my laser engraver. I engraved what type of wood it was and sent it to my friend. And today, actually, I sent it to him. So I look forward to hearing how he enjoys it. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know the last little bit was me not being able to show you a live look at the end product, but I had to get that project out and it was crunch time. I just had to crunch down and focus on the project and not really recording. The last thing is that the issues I was having, I thought it was the epoxy. I thought it was the cleaners I was using, because I recently changed from 70% alcohol to mineral spirits. So I went back to a 99% alcohol, and I thought it was those issues I was having. And it turns out, just happened to be that in my last video I mentioned how I really never experienced issues with it being with temperature. And I believe that all my issues happen because of temperature. So make sure Not that I ever said it wasn't important. Make sure that you're following the recommended temperatures of the product you're using for your epoxy. In the future, I hope to have something to help me where if my epoxy is a little bit chilly, I can get it up to an operating temperature to make it more workable. Because if it wasn't for the epoxy being chilly when I first poured it, I really think that this would have been a one and done project. But like I said, with all the issues that I went through, I'm happy with the end product. So I hope you learned something from my video today. And for you people that are just starting out, don't quit, don't get discouraged. Understand that issues happen even to the people that are really experienced with the epoxy. Stuff happens that you can't plan for. You gotta change course, correct your actions, and do your best to make the project come out to be the best product that you can produce. So until next time, we'll see you later.